So it's really common advice to start your figure drawing with a line of action. Now, if you're doing a figure drawing from life or from reference, I would suggest not starting with a line of action for most people watching this. And you might say, how dare you, way more accomplished artist than you, recommend a line of action. And I really thought it must be the best way to start a figure drawing because so many people say it. But after reviewing thousands of beginner and intermediate figure drawings and doing thousands of my own drawings, I come to the conclusion that it is not usually the best way to ensure your drawings have movement and energy and dynamism. We're going to look at a better way than this. I'm going to show you why the line of action often doesn't work and what we can do instead.
So just in case you're not sure what a line of action is, it's a big sweeping curve that captures the flow and overall shape of a pose, and a lot of people suggest this is a good place to start your figure drawings from. Different teachers define it in slightly different ways, but this is the basic idea we're talking about.
So we need to remember that when we start out with figure drawing, our brains come with this preconceived idea of what a figure looks like, and it pulls all our drawings towards that preconceived idea and distorts them. So this is what it looks like. So it's got a head, right, over a torso with some arms attached on the side and some legs down at the bottom like this. And so inside of that, if you're thinking about a rib cage, it's like this. And if you're thinking about a pelvis, it's something like this. And so it's all in a straight line and it's all facing towards us and it's pretty stiff and boring. So here we have a pretty dynamic pose, and we'll just trace on top of this, you know, roughly what the forms are doing, which way they are looking. So the head is facing off to the side. The rib cage is facing a little bit more towards us, but we're still looking at it from one side. And then the pelvis is really facing towards us quite a bit. And so that gives us the twist. The way the pelvis is facing towards us, the rib cage faces away a little bit, and then the head faces away even more. And then that creates a bit of a squash on this side, a bit of a stretch on this side. Okay. So what's going to happen when we draw this is our drawing is just going to pull everything towards that symbol of what a figure should look like. And so what we'll end up with is a little bit more of the rib cage maybe facing more towards us, less of a squash and a stretch, and maybe even the head not facing away so much, so that everything gets more like the symbol. And maybe you're able to keep the head facing away, but then the rib cage and pelvis ends up being straight. There's always some way, even as you fight against it and try to keep it dynamic, brain finds some little way of reducing the dynamism, making it more stiff. And this happens to 98% of the students that I work with, right? And so what happens with a line of action, the idea is that you start with this big, free-flowing movement through the pose designed to make sure that you capture the dynamism, right? That's the point of it, is to make sure it doesn't get too stiff. But what can actually happen is one of two things, right? So the first thing is that the line of action that you might put down ends up actually being straighter than the original pose. And the reason for that is that the line of action isn't very specific, right? It's just this sort of thing that flows through what we're seeing without really corresponding to any specific points. Like you don't say, oh, the line of action is going from, you know, the nose to this point, right? It's just flowing through the major forms. And so because it's a little bit vague, there is scope for our brains, which really want to be conservative and really want to straighten out the pose, to straighten out the line of action, right? Because we're not really forcing it to be as dynamic as it is. We're giving it some leeway, right? We're being ambiguous about what we're drawing, and so the brain has a lot of scope to straighten things out. But what can happen even more commonly is, let's say you do get a nice strong line of action to start things off, but it's not really clear what the line of action corresponds to in the figure, right? It's not any specific outline or any specific form. So as you start to build the figure on top of it, it's very, very easy for our brains, which really want to straighten things out, even though there was a nice dynamic line of action to start things off, to still straighten out and stiffen the pose. And so this is much stiffer and straighter than the original pose was, right? And so what we actually want to do is something pretty different. What we're going to do is we have these forms, we know which way they're facing, and we know that they are creating a twist. So what we can do is we can make sure that the head is facing this way even more. We'll have the rib cages tilted back against the pelvis. So we'll do that even more strongly and make sure that it's turning towards us a bit, but not too much. And then we'll bring the pelvis back over here even more strongly than it really is, and allow it to face even more the other way versus the rib cage and the head, so that it encourages the twist and it makes the squash and the stretch even stronger in the torso. Because then we're going to make sure that we have the pose really nice and dynamic. All right. So when I actually sketched this earlier, I did not use a line of action. Hopefully it still feels dynamic though, right? Because what I did was, you know, this is I think it might have been a 1 minute sketch or something like that. I put down that rib cage. I made sure it was leaning back because the pelvis is tilted forward. So I wanted to lean the rib cage back, shifted the pelvis across and tilted it forwards like this, made sure it was facing a different way to the rib cage, and then had the head facing off to the side. And I encouraged all of those, the way that those three major forms are different to each other, I just pushed them a little bit more. So if they're twisting, I added a little bit of twist. If there's a squash and stretch, I added a bit more of an exaggerated squash and stretch. And because it's all really specific, these are all things that I can see in the actual figure, right? There's the rib cage, there's the pelvis, there's the rib cage, there's the head. These are all things that I can be really specific about. I can hold my pencil up to the sternum. I can hold my pencil up to the pelvis. So I can be really specific, and I know exactly what I'm drawing. It's like the pelvis is on this angle, but I'm going to push it and draw it on this angle. And my brain, which wants to straighten out the pose, can't argue with that because I'm being so clear and specific about what I want. Whereas if I'm being vague and just saying, I just want to kind of feel the rhythms and I just want to draw like a big line of action, it ends up getting stiff. And so if you've been drawing with a line of action or just drawing like, I just want to kind of feel it and stuff like that in a very vague and ambiguous way, and it ends up actually getting stiffer, your gesture drawing, this may be why. So in this pose, you know what? If you wanted to start with a big line of action, you might go for something like this, right? But I would suggest you think about, okay, here's the rib cage and it's coming down on this angle, but then here is the pelvis coming back up again. And that is making this side all stretched out and this side a little bit more squashed. And then the head comes up even more strongly so that the head is up here like this. So you get those three forms, you think about the squash and stretch they create, you think about the angles between them, and then you push that relationship right there. So it's still really simple, it's still not getting into details or anything, but that's why I started with this shape. You can see the lines are still there, and then I made sure to get that squash and that stretch in the torso, and then bringing the head up and showing which way it's facing. And that's how I put down this sketch in about 60 seconds, and it still retains a lot of the movement and the gesture and the dynamism of the original pose. So here's one more example. I'm going to think about how the rib cage is leaning back, how the pelvis is then leaning forward. So the rib cage is on this angle, pelvis on this angle, and that is making that big stretch side, that big squash side. And that's how I start my drawing, by leaning the rib cage back a little bit extra, pushing the tilt of the pelvis a little bit forward a little bit extra, encouraging that squash and that stretch again, and then making sure that I don't stiffen things up by making the head like too straight. I don't make the rib cage too straight. I don't make the pelvis too straight. Instead, I'm just encouraging them along by leaning that ribcage back, getting that squash and stretch in the torso, and then getting that head looking upwards, because that is part of the pose. That's an important part of what is going on. Whereas if I'd started with a line of action, I might have been a bit confused about where is that line in this pose? Is it just this, because that only covers part of the pose? Is it like this or what? Probably best to go with this. And so I start with this, then I could easily start to stiffen things up, even though I've put that line down, because it just ends up kind of being a random line in my drawing, and then my brain stiffens up the pose anyway. So just a few final notes on the line of action. Some teachers suggest, rather than a sort of line that just kind of flows through the forms, it doesn't really correspond to anything, some teachers suggest going with something that corresponds a little bit more to an outline in the figure. So that might help you to make sure it's a bit more relevant. I still think that starting with the major three forms and pushing the relationship between them is the best way to go when you're drawing from life or from reference. But another use for the line of action is drawing from imagination or creating poses out of your head, or for an illustration, when it has a narrative, for an animation or something like that, which is not what I've been talking about here. I'm talking about drawing from life and from reference. When trying to create a pose from your imagination, it might be useful to start with, you're starting with a blank page and no reference, and you want to give it this overall direction and this overall kind of narrative to the pose. Then you might want to start with a big line of action to build from. But that's pretty different to having a reference in front of you and trying to capture the movement and energy and stuff that you're seeing in the reference. So if you want to get good at seeing those three major forms that I talked about in this lesson, our Fresh Eyes mini course is the best way to do that. I'll link the first tutorial right now, but also you can access the full mini course. It's still free to access with the link below. All right, see you next time.